Now, if you've taken any science class ever, you've probably seen the scientific method. And there are a couple of different types of reasoning that we see in science. And the first type is called inductive. And inductive reasoning is when you look at a bunch of different observations, you take in information about the sights and the sounds and the smells, and then you draw some sort of conclusion. And this isn't something that we're going to see a lot of in biology. The more common type of reasoning that we see in biology is something called hypothetico-deductive or just deductive reasoning. And so this is going to follow kind of that standard scientific method where we have some observations and we make up a hypothesis to explain them. A hypothesis is a specific kind of term in science. A hypothesis is an educated guess. So if I look at people who smoke and people who don't smoke, I can make a hypothesis that people who smoke are more likely to die of lung cancer. This is something that is testable. I can create an experiment, whether that's ethical or not. I can create an experiment to put smokers against non-smokers. And it's also falsifiable. Falsifiable means I can prove it wrong. You are never, ever, ever going to be able to prove something true. Instead, what we do is we support things with information, with data and observations. So hypothesis is kind of like a scientific hunch. Like, I think that people who smoke are more likely to get lung cancer. And then in order to kind of support this, you would need to design an experiment. So when we do an experiment, we want to control for as many things as we can so that the only thing we're testing is our hypothesis, right? So there's a lot of things that go into making a good experiment. And this is something that everybody should really understand because a lot of times, especially now, we're seeing studies coming out and Facebook and Wall Street Journal and BuzzFeed are all hyping, hydroxychloroquine works, hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. Well, what do we know? One thing we can do is go look at the experiments. Was it a good scientific experiment? So something that makes something a good experiment is having a good sample size. So if I'm testing my smoking and lung cancer, do I want 10 people or do I want 10,000 people, right? Generally, the higher the sample size, the better outcome you're going to have. Obviously, we have funding limitations, so we can't have infinite sample sizes. We also need a control. So if I'm testing the incidence of lung cancer in smokers versus non-smokers, I need to look at both smokers and non-smokers, right? So not smoking would be the control. Do those people have less incidence of lung cancer than smokers? Another thing is a psychosomatic effect, right? So this would be something like the placebo effect, right? So if you've heard that before, think about it. What is the placebo effect? This is when the act of simply taking a medicine makes you feel better about it. A placebo is typically like a sugar pill or something that's exactly the same as a medicine but doesn't actually have the active medicine in it. So when we control an experiment, we want to be able to have a group that is taking something, maybe a medication, and a group that's not taking the medication for a control. But we don't want them to know which group they're in. The best type of experiments are called double-blind. This is where the participants in the experiment and the experimenters, that's the double, don't know whether the person is actually taking the medication or if they're on the placebo, the sugar pill. Experiments typically have bias in them. Bias can come from the funding source. There are a lot of experiments from the meat and dairy industry that come out and say that meat and dairy are very good for you. And if you go and look at the bias, a lot of times they have funding from the Cattlemen's Association. That's a very obvious example of bias. But everybody's biased. I'm biased, you're biased, we all have bias. So how could you make an experiment that is not biased? Right? How could you remove bias from an experiment? The short answer is that you can't. Every experiment is going to be biased. but a good researcher will take steps to make sure that their experiments and their conclusions are as objective as possible. And another thing that we need to use in science is statistics. So we can't just look at 30 people and decide based on gross numbers of lung cancer which one gets more lung cancer. What we typically want to do is a statistical test to numerically compare those two groups, the smokers versus the non-smokers, to see is the difference in lung cancer actually significant based on numerical values. And this gives us something that we can kind of use across the board. Everybody knows what statistically significant means. One of the very last steps in the scientific method, and what I think is one of the most important, is peer review. So when you write a paper, what you do is you're going to publish it. And so typically a scientist or researcher will take their paper, smoking causes lung cancer, and they will submit it to a journal. And that journal will send that paper to other experts in that field, so other experts on lung cancer maybe, and have them read it and do a critical evaluation. Typically those people have no idea who the author is, and the author has no idea who the researcher or the reviewers are. And this is done to keep everybody from being biased. And so that way the researchers will either accept it or reject it based on the value of the study. All right, so we've looked at what a hypothesis is, and we've said that the hypothesis is a educated guess. Here's some other terms. A fact is information that can be independently verified by any trained person, right? So if I'm trained enough to use a ruler, I could measure a piece of paper and say that it's 8.5 by 11 inches. And then I could hand that to you, who is hopefully also trained to use a ruler, and you could measure the same paper and come to the same conclusion. So it is a fact that this piece of paper, right, a piece of computer paper, is 8.5 by 11 inches. So that's independent verification. A law is a generalizable description. So everybody kind of knows a few laws, so laws of nature. Take a second and think about it. What's a law that you've heard of? You can take a second and pause the video and write it down. So a law is something where when we observe something over and over and over again, and the object is going to behave in a predictable way, right? So the law of gravity, for example. If I take a pencil and I drop it, assuming that we don't get to make any observations in outer space, let's say we're going to stay on the planet Earth, everywhere I go, no matter where I go, that pencil is going to fall to the earth. And so we come up with things like the law of gravity based on behaviors, observable behaviors. All right, a theory. A theory in science is different from what a theory means in kind of common colloquial jargon, right? So if you were just talking to a friend and you said, hey, I've got a theory, that sounds more like a hunch. That's kind of more like a hypothesis. In science, a theory is a very specific definition. A theory is a very well substantiated idea. So this is some sort of explanation for some sort of phenomenon, and it's supported by facts and laws and observations and hypotheses. It's got a lot of evidence supporting it. We're never going to prove it true, right? Because nothing in science is ever proven, but it's supported. This is as close to proven as you can get. A theory is a very strong, very robust idea. So some common theories are the theory of evolution, the cell theory, the Big Bang theory. And a lot of times people hear the word theory and think, oh, well, it's just a theory. But in science, that's not what the word theory means. Theory means that we've spent a lot of time and effort into this, and we still believe that this is true. All right, so take a moment and reflect on how the term theory is used differently by scientists and in common everyday usage.